Hey, so far so good.
Okay. How's the sound? Is it good in the back? All right, great. So, first and foremost, thank you very much for having me out here. Thank you for coming this evening. I am living in the Scottsbluff-Gary area. That's where I'm based doing a lot of my work. So, really very nice just to be invited by my next door neighbors here to come out and speak. And also, always kind of enjoy the opportunity to talk about research that I have going on. It's really cool to be able to present that, especially to a bird-friendly crowd, I would assume. We all are here for the birds, right? Not like some. Okay, great, wonderful. Well, as you can probably tell from the title slide here, the theme of this evening's talk is going to be grassland birds, namely the thick-billed and chestnut-collared longspur. But time permitting, probably going to give you guys a little flavor of, as well as some of the other research projects we got going on in the Audubon Great Plains, mostly in Nebraska. So, without further ado, here we go. Okay, so probably not news to those of us in this room, but grassland habitat and grassland birds are experiencing the largest loss in habitat and population declines in North America. Over 60% of grassland habitat has been lost since the century, and this number is now actually closer to about 50% of grassland bird populations have declined since the 60s. And this is like a very coarse map, but this is the region we're talking about here, the Great Plains with the three, basic categories of prairie. Most of that grassland loss has been in that tall grass prairie ecoregion there in the east. That has been largely due to land conversion, mostly for agriculture, as you can imagine, based on that is on the map. But threats abound as well in the mixed grass and tall short grass regions. And so I work, most all of my work is in Nebraska, and that is actually a pretty good location when you look at it, both right in the middle, kind of north-south, as well as east-west across the plains. We get a little slice of all the different prairies. You could argue that we don't get true short grass prairie in Nebraska, but I'm not a botanist, and that would probably be a slightly different topic. So, the stars of the show tonight: thick-billed and chestnut-collared longspur. Wonderful little prairie birds, kind of quintessential prairie birds, if you ask me. The very, very basic, life history of these guys. The preference for the thick-billed longspur is your classic short grass prairie, and they, in fact, are actually kind of prefer a lot of bare ground, like no vegetation, so very, very short grass and lots of gaps of bare ground in there. I don't want to say marginal grassland by any stretch, but definitely not, thick, lush grassland, much more kind of short, bare, sparse. Your chestnut collar, on the other hand, prefers the mixed grass prairie, likes to have a lot more going on in terms of vegetation world, so they're going to be found in slightly more different habitat than that. And range-wide, both these species really climb up the ladder in terms of conservation concern. And in Nebraska, they're like our highest tier. State wildlife action plans and state agencies, we have all these very similar designations for kind of birds of particular conservation concern, and both these guys make it to the top of the list in Nebraska. Here's the range-wide map. So you can kind of tell, right, with those habitat preferences, the ranges here sort of follow that, right? Chestnut collared, slightly wider swath for both breeding and wintering and migration, really. Thick-billed, pretty much restricted to the far west of the prairies because they really enjoy that short grass habitat. Same thing with their wintering grounds. Now, as far as why this would be kind of interest in Nebraska, you can see by looking at the range maps, we represent that sort of absolute range edge of their distribution, right? That pure southeast corner there for thick-billed, and really that very, very south as well for the chestnut collared. And diving in specifically in the Nebraska map, so this is chestnut collared. The majority of the birds breeding can be found right there, right next door along the Wyoming border. But of note, we do have very small, kind of low-density populations that breed on the far northern section of the state, right on the South Dakota border, but in much lower numbers. The majority is going to be happening on the panhandle there. And for thick-billed, it is all nestled and concentrated right on the Wyoming border in the panhandle there. Same thing with migration. You're just not going to get them a lot anywhere else in the state. And I will point out, so we are like here right now. So down here, I don't know if everyone's been out, maybe the Panhandle, maybe not. So this is southern Nebraska, this is King County. This little breeding population is a little odd. They prefer a rather different habitat. It's kind of like fallow winter wheat field sort of thing, or sort of recently tilled. This is a very ag-dominated landscape. Interesting for sure, but we don't have a high density of breeding birds there, and because they use such a neutral habitat, not particularly a focus, and not going to be the focus of the talk. Most of our birds are all in this northwest portion of the state, and we're going to be talking about them, because that's like all grass and rangeland up there. Okay, so why even be concerned about this bird in the first place, right? And why am I even here, standing talking to you guys? So I got involved with this at about 2018. Particular Longspur was elevated to threatened in the state of Nebraska. So again, there's those different tiers of kind of conservation designation and so on that different states have. And we put thick-billed up to the top of the list. So when that happens, yes, there's more concern, there's more focus on the species, but we thought we really need something, not only sort of pull all the information that we have together on this bird, but we should really create a roadmap, something that's a guiding star that kind of everybody can look to that would be involved in the conservation of this animal, and just sort of point to, all right, what do we have, what do we hope to achieve, where are we going, what kind of research are we looking to do? So that's where I kind of got involved with some other folks at the state agency. We put together this thick-billed and chestnut-collared Longspur conservation strategy. It's more than one page and a photo. It's like 80 pages. There's a lot of information in there, but we'll cut to the chase on what's going on. So again, really about synthesizing information and then laying that roadmap going forward. You don't have to really worry about the text there. The main thing is, once we put in all the information that we know about the bird in the state, which before recently is very little information, we also compiled what we knew from neighboring states and throughout their range. Then the biggest thing was what's the first step? What's the first thing we need to do in the state? Sounds really simple, but evaluate the breeding distribution, right? This is create a range map specific to the state that we can look to that's updated, has a lot going on, and we see range maps kind of all the time, right? But you don't really think about necessarily what goes into them. Well, I'm about to tell you what goes into them. So here we go. Once again, geography. That's us, kind of. I hope I'm close. The study area here, northwest Nebraska. This is Sioux County. This is where most of the birds are. This is where a lot of the study happened. So that's kind of, you're going to be seeing that rectangle a lot. That's what we're doing. Okay. Great. All right. How's everyone doing? Sound still good? Everyone having a great time? This is going to get a little statistics-y, so if you need to be distracted, now's the time. All right. So how do you build a distribution model? First thing you need is bird survey data. So we had some lovely survey data from some partner organizations for 2020, 2021, and then I had some surveys of my own in 2022. And as you can see, we actually got a pretty good coverage of the county, given that this is very, very little public land out here and even fewer roads. So I would say, got a pretty good coverage. And that dashed line, that's sort of the best guess pre-existing range map that I showed you guys earlier for the state. So that was sort of based mostly on seasonal reports, a little bit of guesstimation, what would be maybe appropriate habitat, that kind of thing. All right, so in building a model for where these birds are going to occur, 9 times out of 10 you're just going to focus on land cover or habitat, which makes a lot of sense, right? You have a forest bird, where's the forest? That's the first place you go. You have a wetland bird, where are the marshes, etc. When looking at Sioux County, Nebraska here, anything that's a yellowy beige, that kind of color, that's a grassland. Well, that's basically the entire county. And it's really hard, especially at this kind of landscape scale, to be differentiating a lot of grassland with this kind of land cover. So that wasn't going to be, at least we didn't think, the best bet going forward in defining where this animal is. Next thing we looked at was soil. And you can see already there's a lot more diversity going on here with the soil types. I'm not a soil person, but it was very helpful to sort of have this layer, build this into the model. And then the last thing we added, which is a bit more intuitive, I would say, given we are again at that far absolute eastern edge of the species range, is looking at elevation. Because in Nebraska, you know, we can get from pretty darn low and move into pretty high once we get to the Wyoming border. And you can see even in this county, there's quite a bit of elevation change. The very far north is actually pretty low elevation, whereas you get to the border and certain parts along the highway there are much kind of higher set up. So this is what we put into the model. We did a couple different modeling approaches. We don't really need to worry about the meat and potatoes there. What we do need to know is how this turned out. So, just a little, the warmer colors, that's a higher probability that an animal is going to be present. Cooler colors, very low likelihood. And this was the first type of model we did. Kind of simple, presence, absence, but the big thing that came out, one, very interesting, a little more variety, distribution map showing up. But the other big thing with modeling species distributions is kind of seeing what on the landscape is making the animal tick, right? So the big things that popped out in this were soil type was really, really strong. Namely an avoidance of like sandy soils with high slopes. These are called valent soil complexes. Would never find longspurs there, and very low prediction on the model for that to happen. And elevation really popped out in our model as well. Higher elevation, better likelihood birds would be there. And again, going back to what we were actually inputting into this, so that like hot pink magenta, that's your sandy valent soil complexes. You know, that's a big old swath of what would just normally be grassland. So that was really good to differentiate. And then when you add elevation to that as well, all of a sudden, right, we're not just relying on, you know, run-of-the-mill grassland to try to find these birds. We're looking at a lot more of what informs where this bird is going to be. Second type of model, this is an occupancy model. It kind of takes into account observer effects. Again, very similar, and the models were extremely similar in their output. The model effects were extremely similar. Again, avoidance of sandy soils, and they prefer that flat or high elevation stuff. So, okay, that was kind of fun, but what does that all tell us, right? So, given that we had these two models, we figured, all right, we've kind of baked into the cake enough variation with the map to sort of have the highest confidence we can once we overlap these two models. All things being equal in normal year, normal conditions, that's where we're going to find these birds. That's where we're confident that this animal is going to be going forward in the state. And you can see, you know, superimposed on that previous map. Previous map was actually pretty close, all things, but, you know, it does really shape those contours a lot more. And now we know kind of what's actually driving where this animal is going to be. And that can be really important for things like, say, someone wants to do some development somewhere, change the landscape, right? It's like, well, you know, maybe avoid these certain areas. And when it comes to thinking about the animal more broadly, is something like high elevation necessarily going to be driving where this animal is in a place like Wyoming, say, where there's like much higher elevation, just kind of everywhere, right? Certainly compared to Nebraska or Montana or what have you. Probably not. But I think it does define the edge of the range very well, because this bird just cannot go further east, it seems, than Sioux County, Nebraska. And I think that high elevation, for us anyway, might be creating those sort of microhabitat features that, again, you're not going to really capture just by looking at where are their grasses, where are their forests, that kind of thing. And last but not least, this lets us target areas for future research, which is where that nice little star is on the map. So, phase 2 of the plan and where the fun really begins. So last year, started a pilot project on breeding demography for thick-billed longspurs. So we got access to a working conservation ranch in northwest Nebraska. There it is, lovely little spot. Some would define it short kind of grass. Again, I think relatively shorter grass would be the best way to put it. It's probably more of a mixed grass prairie, but you know, again, the grass is getting shorter, I guess, is the main point. And then this was really attacking that sort of second phase that we identified in the plan as where we wanted to go in learning about these birds. So main objective, just keep your breeding basics, like nest site selection, clutch size, you know, apparent success, like nest successful, etc. Just the basics, because in Nebraska we really have no targeted study on the breeding behavior of these two species. Okay, what do we find? Here we go. So, this was mostly just me, so manpower was a little low, and I would say I covered about like a square kilometer area over the course of the summer of the breeding season in this ranch. So, not a huge effort by any means, but we did come away with some interesting data. Plenty of territories in both species. As you can see, we had plenty of thick-billed longspurs, 5 longspur nests, and it was like half and half on the apparent success rate there, which is good. We also had 3 chestnut collared nests on the site. Those all didn't make it, but I will say, for starters, this is a really low sample size, so it's not necessarily indicative of things going terribly wrong at the site. And I would also add that it did seem like the chestnut collards on this site did just do things a little bit later. They didn't seem to have any problems re-nesting, and I kind of quit on this site about mid-July, and it did seem like the chestnut collards were sort of going like it was early June still. So I think, especially for a migratory species that gets going in May, they're going to make a lot of different nesting attempts. This sort of happens a lot in migratory birds, so nothing too much to worry about. And there's the nesting dates that we had. I would also add a little caveat. I think they were nesting a lot earlier. It seemed like it was closer that the nest would be put down probably that beginning of the second week of May. And based on the sound of it as well from the recent field stuff that you guys just did, I think this is a pretty early going bird. Now, Sioux County is getting up there, and to me the weather can still be kind of rough in most of May, frankly. But I would imagine these birds are getting going a lot earlier than we think. So, and it's cool to see that that's probably also happening here in Wyoming as well. And as far as the nitty-gritty microsite stuff, so this was really kind of neat to see. So that's my hand for size reference. So these are pretty tiny nests, and these are just plopped right in the ground. Like, I guess it's usually by a grass clump, but again, on a prairie, there's a lot of grass clumps, so it's pretty, they just could be kind of anywhere out there. It's really pretty amazing where they nest. But the cool thing about this site is that we did have a lot of both species present, and it was very intermixed. It was like, it could be 5 meters over there, a chestnut collards teed up singing, 5 meters to my left, there's a thick-billed singing. They were really able, it seemed, to kind of delineate themselves and just be fine with those species around. And where this really pops out is in their nest site selection. So this very fancy device is a little 3/4 meter by 3/4 meter PVC grid I made up. And the idea of this was to create a kind of standardized visual identification of just the vegetation going on in these plots. So I would say this is pretty indicative of kind of how these birds are going about their business with the nesting. Thick bills there on the left. So what do you see? Lots and lots of bare ground, right? Very, very bare ground. That grass is super short. Kind of matches up exactly what they say the bird is doing in other parts of their range. And then again, right next door, a chestnut collared nest. Way thicker vegetation, right? Taller grasses, much less lower amount of bare ground in there. And again, it was just really interesting how this would just pop on what would kind of normally be, I guess, a sort of just looks like a sea of grass, but there's all these little differences. And even these were the most extreme to the middle for both species, meaning this was the highest vegetation thick-billed nest, and that was the lowest vegetation chestnut collared nest. But even still, right, that grass is pretty short. There's still about 15-20% or so bare ground in that grid. And then over there in the chestnut collard, it's actually mostly just dead grass. It's not really bare ground. So really these birds, even in the same site, very close to each other, are able to find the small little differences in the habitat. And this is where I guess the thick-bills kind of meet their edge, but they're making it work. So really interesting to see. And then of course, I'm here at Wyoming. I was invited out late last June to check out the flock by Hillsdale. And to me, when I arrived, I was like, wow. First off, this looked like really short grass to me. And look how flat, kind of high elevation and set up this area is, right? I would bet you dollars to donuts that's not sandy soil. I would imagine it's some type of loam or something like that. And this was just a great site. This is a great site. Already they got birds on territory there apparently. There were loads of birds on territory when I visited in late June, and like, man, if you were just walking around, you saw that bare ground and short grass, when you know it, there was a thick little longspur nest right there. The characteristics hold true. So anyway, it's a great site you guys have there. Very close to the Nebraska birds, frankly. So really cool to see that a lot of this stuff was even holding up right next door over here. So all good things with longspurs. Big thing to take home, I guess, from this here. So in Nebraska, a very restricted breeding range. But when the conditions are right, these birds are going to be present, they're going to be nesting, they're going to be doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is good. I use the term colonies here. That's not like technically the right term, but it does seem to be that with thick-bills anyway, if one's around, there seems to be a fair bit of them around, right? They seem to be pretty good numbers when they pick a spot where they're going to be breeding. Within the bounds of nesting success, when you compare it to the literature, and again, we have a really small sample size, about 50% is actually pretty good. It's about what you would expect from studies in other places like Montana. So that was good. And there's a lot of overlap with chestnut collards, which is really interesting. I didn't really talk too much about this, but this was a working ranch. And as far as the species goes with grazing, I would say highly, highly competitive for a number of reasons. One, again, they really like the grass short, and they kind of like a lot of bare ground. You don't want to necessarily hammer a spot, like overgrazing it, but I think they can take a pretty wide range of near heavy grazing. With that being said, this probably isn't a species where if you create a bunch of short stature grass with bare ground, they're all of a sudden just going to colonize in sort of the prairie breeding areas and so on. Some of that is from the work I did. I would say a lot of this comes from, there's some excellent research out of northeastern Colorado. They looked at this experimentally over like a 10-year time frame. And what they had was like different plots of pasture, slightly different grasses, different grazing regimes that they would rotate, and also different soil types. And yeah, they would try to hammer a spot, make it really short. But those longspurs, if it wasn't that kind of loam soil and it wasn't a spot where they were occurring before, they wouldn't exactly just move over and start using it. So I do think there's something to this idea of when you think about our distribution model, there's probably things going on in the micro scale that are pretty hard for us to see or at least manage on a wide range. And again, if the birds sort of like a spot, they like a spot. But that would be important if you're grazing or doing some type of management with that. We're like, okay, if you have longspurs on your spot, whatever grazing regime you've been up to, probably stick with that, unless it's something totally crazy, but I would say that's probably going to work for thick-billed longspurs in the end. So, all in all, great species to work with. They're really, it's not just little mini Nebraska working on these. Both chestnuts and thick-bills up in their breeding range in Montana and southern Canada, and even on the wintering grounds, lots of research going on these birds. We're trying to track them more in migration. So, an exciting time to be in grassland bird research for sure. And glad these guys are getting their due. I think we still got some time, so you're good. Great. We're going to switch gears. Longspurs are excellent, but I just want to give you guys a little bit. It's not just longspurs and grassland birds over in Nebraska. We're doing some other fun projects. Wanted to highlight just a couple for you guys. First off, so this is an Audubon chapter. Everyone's done a CBC Christmas bird count. Tried to do Christmas bird count. So, way back when, myself and Joel Jurgensen, who's non-game bird program manager at Nebraska Game and Parks, he's kind of my boss. He's been in Nebraska a lot longer than me. He noticed, man, we just don't have magpies the way we used to. So, what did we do? We got some data together, and we published this paper a few years ago. And this is about West Nile virus and the declines of chickadees and magpies. So, the great thing about this is this was like all Christmas bird count. So many CBC circles, as you can see. But the main approach here was like, all right, let's take the broadest view of like the northern Great Plains. We separated it out with 4 basic sections of like the eastern part, which is where magpies had never occurred. We call it like the Central Plains, which is basically Kansas, Nebraska, and Dakotas. Then we had this nice little area, Front Range, I-25 corridor, just high human population, not quite the mountains, but again, there's Cheyenne. And then, yes, the sort of like true Mountain West sort of area. So we broke it down into these 4 sections. We used that extremely fancy and impressive sounding model, log linear hierarchical Bayesian modeling. Apart from impressing everybody, the other point of using that model is that you can actually trend things out based on these regions as well as the overall count going on. And the trick here was, okay, we took counts where there was at least 10 to 12 years of data before West Nile virus would have showed up, which we just kind of pegged as 2002 to be safe. And then it had enough data after West Nile virus showed up to look at these about evenly, right? So conceptually, this is what we did. This would be your graph of the counts for relative abundance of your species of interest, in this case magpies. This would be before West Nile virus shows up. Using that, we can then project, all conditions being equal, what would we expect with like a pretty wide range of variation? What would we expect the counts to look like, say, if West Nile, nothing was going on, nothing had changed from, prior 2002 to after 2022. If the counts, the real counts now, fell within that sort of margin of error, maybe West Nile was going on, maybe a little bit of habitat change, but we couldn't make a conclusion that was like anything really major happened to these bird populations because things are about what they would expect to be. However, say your counts fell well below what you would project to happen before West Nile virus showed up, all of a sudden we would start to make a few conclusions, right? That something changed in that very short amount of time that sent these counts really low. So what actually happened when we did all this? Well, things were really, really bad in the Central Plains for black-billed magpie, unfortunately. As you can see, this dashed line is like our West Nile virus when it showed up. Counts totally cratered. Shockingly low, in fact. Again, now you'll see that the axes are a little different for each region because this is like relative abundance. You would expect more birds in the Mountain West and so on. But while the counts in the Central were already kind of low, they just got crazy low after West Nile. And even in the Front Range area, things went pretty low pretty quick right after West Nile, although there is this slow climb bounce back to like the kind of normal range what we would expect. And then in like the true Mountain West, birds didn't seem all that affected. Those counts, again, they fell right within what we would like sort of expect, all things being equal. So, which would kind of make sense, right? The way West Nile works, that sort of climate isn't great for it, and also, much closer to sort of the core range of the animal. So probably a lot better ability to recover. This is sort of the summary. Chickadees were also part of this. So yeah, the big take home was in that Central Plains, huge declines for chickadees and magpies on Christmas bird counts. Lower declines, but still going on in the Front Range, and then pretty even in the Mountain West, which is all right. So yeah, that was a really interesting thing. Great sort of example, I would say, as well, the value of these long-term monitoring projects, the community science projects, like the Christmas bird count. I have tons of fun on those, but if you're ever thinking like, man, why are we doing these counts on these cold days? It's like, that data can really come in handy sometimes. So, and a bit of good news, I will say chickadees in Nebraska. So the last year we used in the study was like 2017. Just tracking in the last 6 years, chickadees have bounced back in Nebraska, which is nice, everybody. Chickadees. And when I was checking, this was mostly the eastern Colorado counts, but magpies there seem to have also kind of come back. I'd be curious after the talk if anybody's noticed anything with magpies around Cheyenne, eastern Wyoming, if that might be on the mend. Magpies in Nebraska, so apart from like the town where I live in Scottsville, Gary, we have a decent population there, but they used to be all the way east to Lincoln. Never gonna find them anymore. It's really something. So bit of a downer note. And then this wasn't the actual analysis, but again, if you just look at the CDC where West Nile virus was there, right? Dakotas, Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado were the big areas. So yeah, that was a very interesting study. But let's end on a high note. So we're going to now go to a bird that barely would ever find. I think there's like less than a dozen records in Wyoming. However, the punchline is really interesting and cool related to Wyoming. The American woodcock. Probably not the bird you thought you were going to be hearing about tonight, but animal near and dear to my heart, wonderful critter, and this was a project last 3 or 4 years. We started GPS tracking of this little migratory shorebird in eastern and central Nebraska. So you might be thinking, this is like a Great Plains prairie cock. As the name would suggest, this is a woodcock. It's also known as the timber doodle. Both names obviously have to do with like woods and forests and things like that, which is true. They are like the true forest breeding shorebird. I'm not sure, maybe if there's any folks from out east, you hopefully had a chance to see them do their breeding displays in early spring. It's really fantastic. Maybe you've seen them in other contexts. But this really is like the quintessential early successional forest management kind of bird out east. It's like them and golden wing warblers are usually grouped together and like, these are the birds we manage for, this is the habitat they like, but it's all like forest, right? And Nebraska is many things, but it's not a forest paradise by any stretch. So why even look at this bird in this region? Well, for starters, in about the 70s, it seemed like an ever-increasing amount of records further and further west in Nebraska, and that includes a lot more confirmed breeding records in the state. So a pretty obvious, I would say, like, expansion into the state of the species. But when you look elsewhere, Manitoba just had a recent iteration of their breeding bird atlas, and like really big expanding density in like the north central and like western border of Saskatchewan. They have a lot more woodcock breeding in that region. So you know, like we would be right along that migratory corridor. And then the other element is, so that map over there, that is like the main monitoring tool for American woodcock is something called the Singing Ground Survey. Where you like go out in early spring, you listen for them doing like paints, and then they do like displays, super fun. And as you can imagine, and kind of rightfully so, that stops in like central Minnesota, gets nowhere near Nebraska. And even harvest data, this is a game species, but like nobody really harvested it on the plains, so we're totally left off the map. So we wanted to fill in that gap from the Nebraska standpoint. But then there's this other question of like, this is a forest bird, why is it hanging out in the prairie, right? So we use GPS tracking transmitters, which are super great. They send data right to the satellite. Once you put it on the bird, you never have to, you get to watch where it goes. And this is a little animation. This was their spring migration a couple of years ago. You're going to see, that's a woodcock migrating. There we go. Look at that. Wonderful. So a couple things will probably pop out in the animation. First and foremost, when they get moving north, they go pretty fast. I don't know if you can see the little time scale bar, but you know, their migration out of Nebraska kind of begins early April, kind of through about right now, like kind of mid-April. And they don't really linger anywhere else in the plains until they get where they're going, which is like, as you can see, you know, southern Manitoba, western Ontario, you know, northern Minnesota and some parts. But when they're in Nebraska, they actually spend a fair amount of time there. They kind of arrive that first week of March. We coined this term ephemeral breeding grounds because if you've ever been around woodcock in spring at lower latitudes, you know, they are putting in that pretty serious effort into their breeding displays. And, you know, they're hanging out for 2-3 weeks if they're going to migrate out of Nebraska, which is a much longer time than a classic stopover. And we actually have evidence from birds on radio, as well as other sightings, that birds are attempting to breed at those sites, but they just end up leaving those sites a little later on. So you kind of have these overlapping life history things. The other thing we found out with tracking these animals is that about 80% of the birds that come through Nebraska end up, you know, points further north, but we do retain about, you know, 20% or so throughout the summer. And while that's all cool to track migrations and stuff, it's that 20% that things really got interesting. So, as I mentioned before, this is a forest animal. Let's just take a slice of life of one of our migratory ones that went to Manitoba. This is the satellite imagery of all the points where he was hanging out. As you can see, that's a lot of forest. And, you know, these are sort of, I don't know if they're like logging cuts or maybe, you know, some type of infrastructure, but those little cuts are kind of like gold for woodcock because it creates that sort of early shrubby stuff. This is the Google map from the nearest road, and it's like, if you open up the textbook of American woodcock, this is what you see, right? Different structures of aspens, you got some spruce and pine there, some shrubs, some open grass. So basically all our birds that went to the places where they normally are were doing exactly what you'd expect. If you look in the literature, other people that have tracked these birds, 91% of their daytime locations are within some type of forested land cover, shrub, upland forest, wetland forest, that kind of thing. And I work with the species extensively in New England. In the summertime, it's always forests, thickets, that kind of stuff. Nebraska birds do nothing of the sort. Over 50% of our daytime locations in the summertime, so this is like May through September, we're in center pivot irrigated agriculture fields. So that's what on an aerial imagery, like these big old circles, right? That's like a cornfield or a big soy field. And again, a lot of eastern Nebraska is like this sort of, this huge industrial agricultural landscape. Our woodcock, when they would stick around for the summer, seem to gravitate to these, particularly later in the season, like peak growing season for these crops. The points that you see in like what is like kind of restored prairie grassland there, those are mostly nocturnal roosting locations. That's pretty standard fare for a woodcock, save the fact that this is like half sandhills prairie, which obviously doesn't exist in like Massachusetts or whatever. So that would be kind of new to these birds, but, and you know, you see a few as well on kind of the shelter belts and sort of those little property lines, but yeah, they really gravitated to these irrigated agriculture fields. And while this is all very interesting to add to like woodcock specific literature, like, hey, here's this weird behavior out the edge of the range, what's going on? Thinking about it from the grassland perspective, which was the second part of this that we didn't expect, like, okay, what were the two things that are the biggest threats to grassland? So I mentioned earlier, particularly in tall grass prairie, land conversion to agriculture, responsible historically for the biggest loss of grassland in the U.S. The more contemporary problem now is woody encroachment. So that's mostly in the form of like eastern red cedar, kind of in our neck of the woods, but it can really be any shrubby plant. You know, we've over-channelized a lot of the streams and rivers, like that's created good conditions for extra shrubs. If you think about a woodcock, which loves that early successional shrubby stuff, so woody encroachment, and apparently can take advantage of these heavily human-modified landscapes in the form of agriculture, all of a sudden you have this now complementary piece from a forest bird, where we have all this data of grassland birds declining in these regions, right? Counts and stuff like grasshopper sparrows, upland sandpipers on the decline in these regions. We actually have tracking data from prairie chickens, where their range is shifting more and more west in the state of Nebraska, away from these areas of woody encroachment and so on. Well, now we can add a picture of like, hey, when you look at a forest bird from the east, they're also kind of coming in and they're making it work. What I would say this all sort of indicates is that it was once a grassland, and frankly not all that long ago. Functionally, it's not the true pure prairie landscape that you used to have going on here, right? Things have changed very dramatically. I think the woodcock being here and using these habitats are just a symptom of that, right? It's not like woodcock are out competing anything. They're too strange, too unique. They wouldn't just show up and take over an upland sandpiper spot. They would need areas that, you know, your grassland birds like a curlew would just never even think about using, and then the woodcock are going to show up. So it really is this kind of complete picture, sort of complement that we see in the decline of grassland birds. All of a sudden in that same region, your more human-modified species come in. We see this also in gray-tailed grackles and barred owls coming into these areas. So really fascinating, kind of unexpected conclusion that we got from this paper. And, you know, again, you have these areas, I mean, this is sandhills prairie over here. We have woodcock using that extensively. Sandhills doesn't occur anywhere else in the world but Nebraska. I always like to end with this. This is the University of Nebraska Lincoln's turn of the century, and then present day. And yeah, certainly a lot more buildings, but look mostly in the background of these photos. You know, this is all grassland, and that area actually had a little bit of like interior salt marsh. It's all trees, right? Going on in the background of that contemporary photo. So yeah, even in like very recent memory, things have changed pretty dramatically for the prairies. So just an interesting look at yeah, what's going on in these kind of dynamic systems as things continue to change sort of across the landscape. And that is all I have. Thank you again just for coming out tonight, for inviting me out. Email if you ever want to get a hold of me, others have definitely in this room, but it's my name with a dot in the middle at Audubon. You can check out our website at Great Plains. There's some few little features about some of this work. And migration is coming. We talked about it a little earlier. It'll be here soon, folks. So get out there and go for it.
Okay, so what about when the woodcock is nesting in the farmlands? What about the agricultural chemicals? Does that impact them?
That's a great question. So I should have added, so the birds we had that stuck around Nebraska were males, and they don't actually contribute anything to the nest in the woodcock. So they wouldn't be nesting there, but in all likelihood, the reason they were there is because that was a reliably moist soil, right? It's being watered all the time. The short answer is I don't really know what would happen, because there is a lot of somewhat scary emerging data, like particularly with insectivorous birds, like all these chemicals we got going on, what's going on. I don't know what's going to happen, and by all accounts, my guess is for woodcock, this is a pretty new thing. Now, unfortunately, there's a big geography gap between like us doing stuff on woodcock way out there in Nebraska, and then things don't really get woodcock research until you get to like the upper Midwest, or frankly, like the far Northeast is where a lot of it's going on. So it would be interesting to see, like, I don't know, Illinois, or the more like agriculture parts in the Midwest, what's going on, right? Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because like it's probably not where you want to be feeding all the time. That's where those birds would clearly feed. So yeah.
Where do the Longspurs winter?
West Texas, parts of New Mexico, northern New Mexico. So kind of that nice sort of southwestern area there. And they've been doing a lot of monitoring now in those spots. The Bird Conservancy of the Rockies heads up a lot of that research down in that West Texas area.
A couple of things. So do you think the greatest threat to the Longspurs is in the breeding area or the wintering area? And that's
I cannot commit to an answer. Yeah, tough to say, because I think they're probably going to shift north as things go. What's interesting is that, fortunately we don't have out in western Nebraska, I can't speak for Eastern Wyoming, but we don't quite have the woody encroachment problem yet. Hopefully it doesn't become a problem. I think we're done on that. I don't know, is woody encroachment been an issue in the prairies out here, or are you guys too high elevation, basically?
I think we're too high, but there's you go to any farmland, there's usually windbreaks of trees. There's usually trees planted around the houses or the.
And I'd imagine that chopping up is kind of probably a bigger issue. But like if you look at some of the Longspur declines, particularly from up north, it goes it's like 90% on some BBS routes. So probably the breeding grounds. I haven't spent enough time in the wintering areas to know what might be happening.
Yeah, because what we know, well, when we went out yesterday, we saw all the thick build on the south side of that property, where there were basically bare outcroppings along those little knobs, but there weren't any on the north side where it's just more consistent. We had the same thing. We had a few chestnut collar mixed in the taller grass areas where those birds were too. So.
Well, I think if I remember, I was checking my e-bird list like a couple of days before coming here. It's like I think we had like one singing chestnut. He was kind of a lonely, and it was like this little patch, right? It was just like thicker grass slightly on that kind of region.
But there's never places around Cheyenne where you can encounter both of them at the same.
And I've been up to their grounds in like Montana and stuff, and it's the same thing. Like it tends to lean one direction or the other. It's like 80% thick with 20 chestnut, or kind of the other way around. But yeah, it's clearly they find within whatever grassland they're at just the right type of spot. Someone raise their hand? Nope. Okay.
talked about accreditation for the Longspurs. Can you tell us a little bit more about who preys on them?
The only one I saw, and I would also see antagonistic interactions were like the ground squirrels. I expected snakes, honestly. I heard snakes is the thing over there. I didn't see a single snake on the property. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't there eating, but like I would see adults frequently start to get agitated and sometimes even go after ground squirrels when they were out. So I just assumed that that's who the main predators were. Another issue, and I had a nest on there that I couldn't conclude what happened. I talking to some other people that worked with them in Montana. A big issue is actually hailstorms that end up causing a lot of nests to fail, which like can't really do anything about that, unfortunately. Yeah, I think a hailstorm came through on one and started to track it. That's actually, it's not a predator per se, but
Right.
that's a big challenge, I think, for a lot of nests.
Are landowners concerned about the listing by the state of the species of concern?
So, not really. It doesn't work like Endangered Species Act or federal stuff when we elevate it to the state. Now, there could be a case, there is one level up where we could state list it. We didn't do that, probably for the reasons that you're talking about here. And when that does happen, you have to get into things like, some agreements and just, or just, doing due diligence kind of thing. But fortunately, it's not, and it's kind of almost better sometimes to go on the state level because once something gets federally listed, there are a lot more rules involved. This is fortunately something where like before it gets so bad where we have to list it, let's just kind of get our groundwork under us. And then again too, like kind of seeing this now, I think we're in a more comfortable place so far, which is like, okay, this bird is present. They're not doing amazing, but given that we are like really on that edge, they're actually where they should be in the state. So that is encouraging from the Longspurs standpoint.
Have the wind farms really, caused problems with their nesting?
Great question. So we don't have those where they nest in Nebraska. There is some research on that I think it's out of Wyoming actually. Trying to remember the professor that did that, but I would check out that research on that and what's going on. But yeah, we don't have the wind farm issue in Sioux County, so no answer on that.
More question. So you had one of the little Longspurs in your hand.
Yes.
How do you capture them? Do you use a mist net? You do?
Yep. So different researchers use different techniques with these guys. I'm a mismatch guy, kind of always have been. I will say it took a lot of learning because it is just there's no like frame of reference, there's no points with it, so you kind of look foolish a little bit because these birds clearly see what's going on. But there is kind of an act to it. We didn't focus too much on the banding, but we did want to sort of proof of concept that in case some of our partner organizations they're doing a lot more in the banding. So if they ever need anything from our neck of the woods, that was kind of like, we can do it, should be the call, but yeah, that was misnets, but some people will use like kind of ground traps by using something like that, but misnets work just fine. And they do have a thick bill up close. I was always a little dubious of that, but then I saw, like, wow, yeah, that's something.
I guess that's it.